Welcome to Doctor Speaks. Today we have amidst us an extraordinary presence, a gentleman doctor who has several accolades to his credit. We are talking about Dr. D. Nageshwar Reddy. Dr. Nageshwar Reddy is the chairman of Asian Institute of Gastroenterology Hospitals, Hyderabad, a veteran medical expert with pioneering work in gastroenterology, particularly advancement in the therapeutic pancreatic biliary endoscopy and innovations in transgastric endoscopic surgery. Recently, he became the first Indian to be conferred with the renowned Rudolf V. Schindler Award from the American Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, and also another distinguished achievement of being inducted into the Fellows of the prestigious American Association for the Advancement of Science as the first Indian medical doctor in the last 100 years to receive this fellowship. For his distinguished research in gastrointestinal endoscopy, particularly in therapeutic pancreatic biliary endoscopy and innovations in transgastric endoscopy surgery, he was conferred with Padma Bhushan and Padma Shri. A specialist in gastrointestinal endoscopy, till now he has shared his deep knowledge by publishing over 670 papers in national and international peer reviewed journals and contributed chapters in 20 international textbooks of gastroenterology and edited gastrointestinal endoscopy textbooks. Namaskar, welcome to Doordarshan, Dr. Nageshwar Reddy.
Thank you.
At the outset, I would like you to talk about the award that you won, the Rudolf Schindler Award.
Yeah.
What does it entail and how do you earn it?
Yeah, Rudolf Schindler Award is the highest award given by the American Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy to any endoscopist in the world who has done research, publications, and is involved in teaching endoscopy to everybody. This award is given once a year for last 60 years, and over the last 60 years it has been given mainly to Americans. In fact, there are only two non-Americans who received this award. One was a Britisher by name Dr. Paul Swain 10 years back, and the second one is being given to me, an Indian. So the first time an Indian has received the award, and I'm actually proud not only getting the award but also because it represents the contribution that India has made to the field of gastrointestinal endoscopy. So it's a great honor to receive this award.
And India is proud of you. Why was the COVID-19 second wave very severe in India?
Yeah, the reason why it's severe is that if you look at historically for all coronaviruses or all types of pandemics that occur with viruses, the second wave is usually always more severe than the first wave, and that is one. Second, of course, the second wave, I think what happened was that the virus got a mutant, it became mutated, and because of this so-called double mutant, it became more infective, and then it infected more people. Although we know that infection is more, we haven't seen dramatically increased death rates. There is some increase in death rates, but not dramatically. So this is a combination of a natural phenomena and the presence of a mutated virus which is more infectious, and therefore the second wave is much higher than the first wave.
So tell us about this mutation. What happens within the virus when it mutates, and how, in what way does it become dangerous and life-threatening?
Yeah. So these virus mutations predominantly, this is a normal phenomenon. Mutations occur in all RNA virus, can occur in any part of the virus. As the virus is replicating, it actually produces a lot of errors, and these errors are manifested as mutations. Normally in all of us in the cells, we have a factory which corrects the mutations. But for this virus doesn't have, unfortunately, this factory. So mutation that occur is not corrected and is propagated. Some of these mutations can be beneficial to the virus and some can be dangerous to the virus, so it dies out. The beneficial mutations continue, and most of these beneficial mutations are occurring in the spike protein region of the virus. The spike protein region of the virus is the one where the virus gets attached to the ACE2 receptor in human cells. And if there's a mutation in this area, this can make the virus more infective because it can get attached faster to the cells. It can move from outside to inside the cells faster. So these mutations are actually change in amino acid sequence that occurs in the protein. In case of this double mutant we are seeing, at least 17 amino acids have changed, 2 of them in strategic areas, and therefore it's called the double mutant. And because of this, the virus has greater infectivity and the greater chance of entering into the cell.
So, is it true when they said in a second wave that certain bracket of age group, like perhaps maybe the youth, were more affected? Is that true according to you?
Yes, we certainly statistically have seen more cases affecting the age group between 30 to 50 in the second wave than the first wave. There are several reasons for this. One of the reasons is a lot of people above the age of 45 years got vaccinated in the first wave, and they were more careful in the second wave period. In second wave, I think a lot of youth were a little careless, were not wearing masks, were not maintaining physical distance, and were exposed to the virus more often. These are the 2 main factors. In addition, for some reason, this virus seems to have a propensity to attack younger people and even children because of the mutation compared to the first time.
So, when you say propensity to attack younger and children, how does it know?
No, because ACE2 receptors which are there in the body has different distribution in different age groups. In the younger age group, the distribution is less, and as we grow older, the distribution increases. If the virus becomes more infective, even if the distribution of ACE2 is not so much, it can still attack that person because of increased infectivity. So if age groups lower than 45 are a little careless in terms of masks and all, earlier on because this virus was not attacking them, they were getting away with it. But because the virus became more infective, it started attacking, and that's the reason why you're seeing more of this virus.
There has been a lot of talk about the third wave and children being affected, etc. What is your opinion, Dr. Reddy, on this?
Yeah, I think the natural consequence of all these epidemics are there will definitely be a third wave and a fourth wave. Now, the intensity of this wave, how much will it be, will depend upon us. If we can vaccinate a population very quickly within the next 3-4 months, if we maintain COVID appropriate behavior in terms of masks and keeping distances, then we can actually abort the third wave or make it very low, ineffective third wave. But if we don't do that, then of course we'll have a third wave. It won't be so intense as second wave, but definitely it will be quite damaging. Now regarding children, we are seeing more children being affected, but my personal opinion is that in third wave, we won't see many children, lot of children, because already children are getting infected and immune. The third wave is not going to be a wave of children. It will be in a similar fashion as we have the second wave, but with a lower intensity.
So, children have better immunity, they are more robust immunity, so they fight back better. Is that correct?
It's partly correct, but the reason why children are not affected is for several reasons. One is because the ACE receptors are very less in children, so the virus doesn't have a host mechanism to attack it. The second reason, of course, is the immune reaction in children is different from adults. The immune reaction in the children is good at eliminating the virus but doesn't produce so much cytokine storm. And the major reason for the illness in adults is the cytokine storm. This doesn't seem to occur so much in children.
Okay. So now coming to the question of the medication that we used for treatment of COVID-19 first wave and also the second wave. Now we have pulled back on remdesivir, we have pulled back on ivermectin, we have pulled back on steroids and also plasma therapy. So how do you see it? Is research evolving, and are we experimenting with our the drugs to use?
Yeah, this is a good question. This virus which has come in such a massive fashion is the first time. So human beings didn't have an exposure to this virus before, nor did we have the experience of how to treat it. In general, most viral infections do not have a specific treatment for them. Now, when this virus came, we didn't have enough time to develop new drugs. So what was done was already drugs which are present for other viruses were tried for this, and among all these drugs, the most useful one was remdesivir. Now, remdesivir, I personally believe, is still useful when used with definite indications. It should not be used for everybody, when definite indications are that it's useful. Steroids are useful in the second phase when viremia is gone and there's inflammatory response, cytokine storm from the body. But again, steroids has been indiscriminately be used. It has to be used very carefully in proper doses in the right indications. Regarding plasma therapy, again, lot of controversies. The problem with plasma therapy is that you have to use the plasma therapy within the first 5 days, and the patient who has donated the plasma should have adequate antibodies. These were not present in the most of the cases, but now with the advent of monoclonal antibodies, plasma therapy is no longer needed in most of the patients. These monoclonal antibodies are better than diluted antibodies that we see in plasma. So in my opinion, the treatment is evolving. We still don't have a perfect drug to eliminate this virus, but among the drugs that have come now, monoclonal antibodies is very promising in the early phase. In the second phase, when the patient is moderately or severely ill, remdesivir still has a role if it is used within 7 days. And in the third phase, when the patients go into more severe disease, require oxygen, steroids, usually dexamethasone in 6 milligram dosage, is helpful, but has to be used only for a period of about 2 weeks, not more than that.
AIG is using the polyclonal antibodies treatment.
So these are special antibodies which are created from single B cells. Very high concentration of monoclonal, that is coming from a single clone antibodies are taken, and these are injected in a cocktail, that is two together are injected. And we have found that if it is given within 7 days, certainly within 3 days after testing positive, the protection is almost 100%. That is, very few people in whom this is given progress to serious disease. But these antibodies cannot be given to everybody. One is a cost factor. It costs about 70,000 rupees to give this. Second is, if you give it indiscriminately, you can develop mutant virus. So this antibody we are now advocating only in certain patients, those above the age of 65 years, those who have comorbid conditions like type 2 diabetes, chronic kidney disease, immunosuppressed patients, and most importantly, those patients are very obese. If the BMI is more than 35, or they have any of these comorbid conditions above the age of 65, then we are advocating this monoclonal antibodies. We have used it in about 40 patients in the last fortnight with almost 100% response. All of them within a week have become negative for the virus, and none of them have developed symptoms of the COVID disease itself.
Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, we understand, also has a cost-effective testing method using the patient's saliva. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, this is another interesting observation made, that if you look at the RT-PCR tests, they come negative, which can occur in 30% of the patients. We repeatedly go on doing this test, first time, second time, third time, and so much cost involved. We found instead of that, if you just take a single sputum from the patient, ask the patient to cough out, and the sputum or saliva is taken, this is tested, there is a 90% chance of positivity occurring with this. And therefore, this will save the cost of repeated testing. So this has just been published in BMC, and this may help us in terms of saving costs to the nation of repeatedly testing these patients.
Asian Institute of Gastroenterology has come up with a new research that says that a single dose is enough for a person who's just got out of after being affected by COVID. How does this work, Dr. Reddy?
Yeah, this is also another interesting finding that our research department did. We know that there is scarcity of vaccine, and whatever vaccine is there has to be preserved. So we thought, should everybody given the 2 doses of vaccine, or some people can be given just 1 dose to be enough? So we took all the staff who were infected with this virus, and 4 weeks later we gave a single dose of vaccine. The other group of staff were not infected with the virus, and they also got a single dose of vaccine. When we looked at the antibody levels after the people who have infection versus no infection, we found that single dose of this vaccine produced 10 times the antibody level which is produced by in people in whom there is no infection. So if you have an infection and after 4 weeks take the vaccine, the antibody levels are almost 100 times. Plus in these people the memory cells are also very high, indicating that they can have long-term immunity also. So our based on this paper, what we are suggesting is, this paper was published in International Journal of Infectious Disease, and based on this, what we are suggesting is that if you have COVID infection, if you take a vaccine after 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, a single dose is sufficient to protect you for the next 12 months. You don't have to take the second dose.
So what happens after that? Do we take a booster dose or how does it?
Yeah, this is again important question. We don't know now how long this vaccination induced immunity in general sense also, nobody knows. It is believed that we might have to take this vaccine and all types of COVID vaccines at least once every year. So this will become like the flu vaccine which we take once a year, and this will help us to prevent these infections. But as you go along, more studies are being done. We'll know definitely in future how protective this is.
We noticed that compared to the last month or April even, that dependency on oxygen and emergencies for the want of oxygen were more in number, but now they have come down. So how do you read that? How do we read it medically?
Yeah. So as the overall infection rate has come down from 4 lakhs to say 90,000 or 1 lakh, proportionately the number of people who require oxygen or who develop second infection has come down. But I think I want to again warn the public at this point, be careful. Don't think that again everything is going off. It can always come back if you don't follow COVID appropriate behavior, or if you are careless in terms of physical distancing, masking and so on. Also, extensive vaccination is very important. Only when we follow all this, the chance of it coming back is not there. We are happy now, things are coming down, oxygen requirement is coming down, admissions are coming down. This is because the general incidence of the disease is coming down, and the peak of the second wave has come down much faster than what we anticipated down.
So vaccination and COVID protocol is still the answer, and it will be the answer for some time to come, is what you are saying.
Yes, certainly, that's exactly, you nailed it rightly. These are the two things that are going to save us from this virus.
Why postmortems are not allowed in COVID deaths?
No, it's not that postmortems are not allowed. Postmortems are generally not done for many reasons. Generally, there's a reluctance among the pathologists because the COVID secretions, when they're doing a postmortem, can contain large amount of virus, can be transmitted to those who are doing this. Second is the amount of information we may get from this postmortem may not be very high. Already we have a lot of information about this virus. So what is now practiced in many parts of the world is what is called segmental biopsies of the involved region. For example, once a patient dies and the relatives give permission, we can take biopsies from the lung or liver or whichever affected part to see what is the nature of this infection. So this is sufficient to give us adequate knowledge now.
The symptoms have been changing. The symptoms have not been consistent. Once upon a time it was cough and cold, and then diarrhea came in somewhere in between. So gastroenteric process, how does it affect COVID?
So in the first wave, this is more often seen. About 30% of patients with COVID will have some sort of gastrointestinal symptoms. Usually this form of nausea, vomiting or diarrhea, or some of them get severe abdominal pain. Also the liver can get involved in 30%, the liver enzymes increase, and some of these patients can develop jaundice, and we have seen patients coming with acute liver failure and dying because of this. If you look at all the patients, 10% of the patients with COVID don't have any other symptoms except gastrointestinal symptoms. They have only diarrhea, nothing else. So we can miss the diagnosis. The reason why they develop these symptoms is because even in the gastrointestinal tract, like the respiratory tract, we have ACE2 receptors, and this virus can go and sit on the ACE2 receptors, producing gastrointestinal symptoms. The virus is present in the stool of a person more than 2 weeks after he is recovered completely also. So it stays for a very long time in the stool. Similarly, the virus can attack the pancreas, giving rise to severe pancreatitis, or sometimes attach to the islet cells, giving rise to severe diabetes. So all these are part of gastrointestinal manifestation of this disease, which can occur quite extensively in these patients.
Could you please touch upon the black fungus?
It's called mucormycosis. Mucormycosis is a fungal infection which is an opportunistic infection. So whenever the body immune system comes down, there are some receptors in the nose which get upregulated, and this mucor fungus, which is present in many of us normally in the throats or in the environment, can go and get attached to this receptor area and can produce infections starting from the nose, sinuses, goes to the eye, it causes damage to the eye, and then goes into the brain. So it's called rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis, producing extensive damage. Once it enters into the body, it's very difficult to remove. We use a very costly drug called amphotericin B, which is also very toxic. In addition, surgery has to be done to remove all these parts. So it can be quite devastating for the patients. And we found that it developed in those patients in whom steroids have been used extensively or abused, those patients who have diabetes mellitus which is not properly controlled, or those patients in whom oxygen is not given in hygiene fashion. These three are the ones which can lead to mucormycosis or the black fungus and give rise to all these symptoms.
So there were a lot of misinformation about pregnant women being affected by COVID and what they should do or should not do, and whether there was a lot of misinformation about this. What is the right thing to do? Is the risk the same for a pregnant lady and others?
Yeah. In general, even if it affects the pregnant lady, the clinical presentation is similar, no difference. Fortunately for us, there is no evidence that this virus actually enters through the placenta into the newborn. It doesn't seem to go through this. But the fortunate thing also is that if mother has antibodies against the virus, these antibodies can go through the placenta and reach the baby. Similarly, if mother has antibodies against the virus, it can go through the breast milk. So that's the reason why in our recommendation all over the world is breast milk, mother who is doing breastfeeding, you can take a vaccine very safely. It not only protects the mother but also protects the infant. Now during pregnancy, whether we can take the vaccine or not, some controversy. The Ministry of Health in India has not allowed it, but in Western, for example, 90,000 women in USA have received the vaccine during pregnancy. This is mRNA vaccine and they haven't developed any side effects. Whereas we still haven't any recommendation to take it in pregnancy in India. So for women who are breastfeeding, it is safe to take the vaccine, but during pregnancy we are still not sure. But I would advise that the pregnant women is not much more dangerous. But if once mRNA comes to India, then I think pregnant women can also take the vaccine.
So there were reports recently that the second vaccine, the second shot, can be a different vaccine. It was said that only when you take Covaxin, you continue to take the second shot as Covaxin. But how much truth there is that we can mix, perhaps?
Yeah, so this is only in India it's not recommended, the government doesn't recommend it, but studies in Spain, for example, have shown that if you take AstraZeneca vaccine first dose, you can follow it up by taking Pfizer, which is mRNA vaccine. So studies have been done only for vector vaccine and mRNA vaccine, not for other vaccines. Data is being collected all over the world now using these two vaccines, and certainly when you use this type of vaccine, a vector vaccine and mRNA vaccine, there is evidence that immunity occurs increasingly, it can be boosted up. But there is no evidence that it actually occurs with Covaxin and Covishield and so on. So therefore, it's not recommended in our country. So you must take the same vaccine what you've taken.
Okay. India sailed through the first wave, but second wave hit us a little hard. But however, you said that the casualties were not as much, but then the spread was too far and wide. So, and it was also said that perhaps our medical infrastructure needs rebooting. So what is it that we should do? More beds, is that the answer? More oxygen plants, is that the answer? What is your opinion?
Yeah. So regarding the oxygen, in fact, actually the oxygen deficiency, India has the capability of producing 10 times more oxygen also. It was actually deficiency in terms of transporting this oxygen. So we didn't have enough oxygen transport trucks from where oxygen is manufactured to different hospitals. That can be very easily corrected. You import a large number of trucks, which already the government is doing, so this problem will be solved. Second, this problem also can be easily solved because now we have oxygen generating units in each hospital. That is, you can have large units which can generate oxygen from atmospheric air without needing to depend on oxygen from outside. Because of this, I think this oxygen problem is very easy to solve. It won't be a problem in the future. The problem about beds is it's difficult to immediately create large number of beds because this pandemic occurs in a short period of time, and to create a large number of beds, to expect a pandemic every time is not cost effective. So we have to see how these beds can be managed very effectively. The third important point is the type of care, especially in semi-rural areas, in semi-urban areas and in the villages, has to be definitely looked upon very seriously by the government. For a period of time, government has to seriously see how we can actually invest into health infrastructure, especially in the villages, in the first tier and second tier type of towns, because in the cities, especially in the metropolitan cities, we have enough tertiary care centers. Government just has to tweak the government hospitals a little, make it a little better. That can look after the public care. But what the government has to really do is to look after segment of populations in the rural areas. But this will take us at least 5 to 10 years to come to a certain level which is decent and comparable to what is happening in other countries.
So, during COVID, in both the waves, first wave as well as the second wave, we have noticed that a lot of advocacy about for home remedies. People people advise that you take, pepper and all kinds of home remedies. Was that advisable?
But yeah, the problem with home remedies is as long as they're safe, it's okay. As long as they don't do any harm. They may be, especially some compounds which are being given, which may be harmful. You have to be careful about them. But simple home remedies like pepper or inhalations and all, as long as they're safe, it's okay. Now, are they effective? That's another matter. Unless we do scientific randomized control trials, we cannot say how effective they are. For example, we used to think that steam inhalation is very effective to prevent this virus. But there's a very nice study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. We showed that steam inhalations does not prevent one person transmitting the virus to another person. So there's none, but you can take it. There's no harm in taking it because it does not cause any problems. So you have to be very careful about what we advocate. As scientists, as medical doctors, we can only advocate what treatment has come in form of a randomized controlled trial to say it's effective or not. Those treatments which are not in this randomized controlled trial, you can try them provided they are safe. But if the safety is in doubt, one should not unnecessarily advocate them.
How do we tell that the curve has flattened? What are the indicators? How do we know?
The flattening of the curve is mainly known by several factors. One is test positivity. So how many, for example, in Telangana, if you have 8,000 cases today and tomorrow it goes down to 7, 5, 4, this is one, the incidence. Second is it also depends upon the test positivity. Suppose you do 100 tests. If 10 are positive, that is 10% positive. Slowly it comes to 4%, 3%, 2%. That means the curve is flattening. Then of course hospital admissions. Third is hospital admissions. Per day, how many hospital admissions are occurring? So these three are indications of flattening curve. What is not an indicator is death rates, because death rates occur much later than flattening of the curve. Even after the curve has flattened, people continue to die in higher numbers and death rates come down at a much later rate. So we have to take three parameters for flattening. Death rate is not taken as a flattening.
After listening to Dr. Reddy, we can safely conclude that vaccination and maintenance of COVID protocol are the only weapons in our hand to drive away the coronavirus. Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy, for your invaluable inputs. Thank you for talking to Doordarshan.
Thank you. Thank you.